About 2 months ago, I woke up to an email from a man named Scott. He had seen my previous video on the first electric piano, the Vivitone Clavier, and was interested as he had one. Now, for those who don't know, this was an instrument that came out in the early 1930s, which introduced features that wouldn't be popular until almost 25 years later with the Wurlitzer electric piano and the Fender Rhodes. Because it was so early, there were only maybe 30 made, plus they were super expensive for the time, with inflation being around $10,000. And keep in mind, this is early 1930s Depression era. So with that said, there are currently only 3 known models still around, with this one being the third. And arguably the craziest part of this whole email was the fact it was only 30 minutes away from me. And yes, this is technically the second electric piano, though it's the first that uses something other than strings to generate the tone, which in my field is an electric piano. How far back do you know in terms of, so it's your great-grandfather?
My great-grandfather.
Okay.
Sometime in the mid-1930s, so 1935, give or take. My grandfather was a young teenager when they got this, and he had it ever since, and I got it after he passed in 2003.
And then you, so since 2005, has this been in your house, or has it just been in here?
It's been in this warehouse, crated up ever since.
Wow. Now, Scott also mentioned that his great-grandfather lived in the 1200th block in Rogers Park. Do you want to guess where Lloyd Lohr lived? And the more you look into this coincidence, the more everything lines up. You see, on first glance, this was an early model. I mean, the insides look completely different from the later National Music Museum model that I previously saw. There's just a lot of places with screw holes that aren't being used and brackets that are kind of lined up. And for this to be a prototype model could very well be. Maybe Lloyd was a friend or a neighbor that was just happened to be making a new electric instrument and his great-grandfather was interested. We don't know. And real quick, I wanted to show you the bottom of the action bracket. It has little pieces of paper used as shims. And this one in particular is from Bush and Lane Piano out of Holland, Michigan. They closed in 1931. You'll also notice the reed bar and pickups are much different from the National Music Museum model. These have more individualized coils and a much more crude reed bar. And looking more closely at the back reed bar, you can see where they were outlining all of the pieces for the reed bar, and even better, a date. January 30th, 1934, JH. Now, along with that is this Vivitone number 9. And after consulting with Roger Siminoff, pretty much the all-knowing guide on Lloyd Lohr, which he also donated the National Music Museum model, by the way, he says that this is pretty much Lohr's handwriting. He matched it up with some examples he had, and it's pretty close. Like any other keyboard, first step was cleaning. And man, did this one need it. I don't think I've ever seen front rail felts just completely disintegrate. I don't know what they were using. I mean, you could see the white balance rail felts are fine, but these look like they're dryer lint. So I'm saving some of them just to get the thickness measurements out of it and kind of average that out, since I'm sure they're probably decayed enough for that not to matter. But we're going to go ahead and clean out the rest of the inside before continuing. I also found this interesting sine wave diagram, which I'm assuming is from him. Also, check out these hand-cut routes for the action. I just thought that was fun. I also found it interesting that once brushed off, the reed bar top has the machine lines for where you would drill out the screws. And even some of them have their notes. While it's off, let's go ahead and apply some dry film lubricant to all the pins so they have a nice, smoother action to them, even though they're pretty clean. Let's go ahead and put the keys back in the action. Notice how I do not have any front rail felts on. We'll talk about that later. Now with the keys on, we can go ahead and clean the top of them. During this process though, I did notice some of them were staying down, which is interesting because the back of these keys are weighted, but the front aren't. So it makes for an action key-wise that can return without the action in, which is really interesting because normally a key on a grand piano or an upright is weighted on both sides to be balanced, but here we're having a unbalanced key, which is convenient enough because now we can see what keys are sticking. You'll see the ones that are staying down are obviously a little sluggish and are requiring some pressing of the bushing felts. What I'm doing right now is slightly compressing the wood just outside the felt to open up that hole and allow for it to smoothly move on those two pins. In this case, all of the balance rail felts were a little tight, so I had to squeeze pretty much every single balance rail bushing in each key. On longer jobs like these, I like to use a specialty soldering iron attachment, which allows me to heat up a caul to push into that bushing slot and ease it with heat and steam rather than mechanical force. Because I get this. But they're all done, and that's what matters. So next up, we go to key squaring, basically making sure that every key is straight and in line with each other. So we're just going to tap those balance rail pins side to side to even them out. There were a few keys that were a bit unevenly spaced, so we're going to go ahead and bend that front rail pin side to side with a specialty regulation tool to move those and make them nice and even. Now let's all watch me fumble this action install. Forgive me, it's literally the first time I've ever done this. Or really anyone. Since Lloyd Lore at least. I want you guys to take a look at the gap you can see from that brass capstan to the top of that felt. That is called lost motion, which normally on a grand piano action like this is technically modeled after, that would adjust the hammer rest height. But on here, there's no hammer, and that doesn't directly affect that height, at least significantly. So I'm treating it as an upright piano, and I'm just going to get rid of that lost motion. Unfortunately, there was an insane amount on every single key, so I went ahead and took off the action again and just did 2.5 turns for each capstan, and that got me right about where I should have been to do a final, more precise check. Now let's go ahead and put in our new key felts. These are much thinner and are going to lower the key pretty significantly, which will stop the bottom of the key front from being exposed over the case. Now we're going to put in our new front rail felts since those old ones were really gross. These are measured to the approximate thickness of those decayed ones. And now we're going to swap out the balance rail felts to the new, thinner ones. With those all on, we can now get our keys back into the key bed and start leveling. I'm just going to level off the highest key, which here is about 74 millimeters. So we're going to raise our end keys and start slowly bringing all the keys up. All we're doing is taking off that felt, putting in a paper punching, and then putting the key back on. Different paper punchings have different thicknesses, which determine how much the key rises. We also have to do this with the sharps or accidentals, as they get out of level too. Here I am checking the key dip, which is pretty spot on. Though I did measure key dip without the action on, so it might be a little skewed. Here we can see I still have a little lost motion in some of the keys, so we're going to fine tune some of those to fix it. And with those all good, let's go ahead and take the action off again. Now that we're taking out the action, we can take a good look at it and see what exactly is going wrong with that base end. And here it is. This is technically the rail that adjusts your let off, or where the plucker decides to stop plucking the reed. That just fell out. So screw that in, and now we get to put all these pieces back into where they were before. So checking on all sides of the action, you can see where those little N-looking pieces go, and they just popped off. So I'm going to go ahead and mark each one of those with chalk and then take them all out to replace. And I guess I shouldn't really say replace, because I literally have to find which one matches that specific piece and then reglue it. I repeated this step for all, I think, 8, and they turned out pretty fine. So while those were clamped, we should now address our pluckers, which have this interesting black material on them. What I did was took a file and ever so slightly dragged it against it, and it did smooth down that tip, at least the black portion. So you can see just how rough the reeds did a number on that black plucker portion. So I'm going to go ahead and with the file smooth down those ends to make them much more uniform and hopefully give us a much easier time when regulating. The black material was pretty soft, so I didn't have any need to remove each plucker. I'm not too sure what this material is, and I hope it doesn't have some sort of carcinogen in it. Now we can go ahead and put all of those whippings back in the action now that those pieces are dry. And what those pieces did, at least the little ends that popped off, they were for the damper mechanism. They would basically give a little bit of a prop so that this little felt knob would get pushed up by that, and then it would actuate the damper section or stop dampening that reed. Without it, the reed would be dampened while it's being plucked, so you wouldn't get a great sound, or any sound at all. And speaking of sound, let's get started on our signal path, which are our 2 leftmost pedals. They control a potentiometer that changes the high-end tone of the keyboard. Also, look at this cool hand-drilled cover. Here you can see the brass teeth for the gear and that wooden middle gear, which is missing some teeth. These were marked in pencil by the previous person, either Lore or someone working, so it was relatively easy to know how to put it back together. But once I got that gear off, we can then go ahead and remove our potentiometer from the housing. Here you can see that capacitor. This is basically what dictates what frequency to cut off. But it wasn't really cutting off anything. Probably because it's a 100-year-old capacitor. So what we're going to do is replace this faulty gray cable that goes to the pot with this not faulty 1/4 inch. Though with that new cable, we were still getting the same amount of hum, just a little less crackling. So we decided to put the pedal mechanism back together the way it was, but completely remove it from the signal chain, which means we're totally bypassing those two pedal mechanisms in hopes that it would make it a little quieter. Yes, you could go ahead and redo the potentiometer or the capacitor to maybe void it, but we wanted to keep it relatively original. And it seemed there used to be a spring here that would push and return the damper assembly, but it seems to have snapped off. So once we got to that noisy cable part, we thought, well, why don't we try shielding it like the one at the museum is? Because that museum model is heavily shielded on almost every surface that the action is in contact with. So we went along and made a giant hot glue gun and put these big sheets of metal on the top and back sides of the case and went along to ground them. Now here, the reed bar is grounded, so I thought, why don't we just stick the grounding wire in the reed bar and it should be fine. And, well, this is what happened. You see, there is a giant broadcasting tower about a mile up the road from this warehouse, so Scott thought that it's probably due to all of the frequencies they're blasting. We also decided to take off the transformer just to see if there was anything we could find inside of it, and no luck. So with that done, it was time to get to voicing, which the middle keys do kind of play, but there are some that just flop out. So what I get to do is move this plucker back and forth to find the correct distance between the reed and how much of it is being plucked by that plucker. Too much plucker and you're going to have a hard key that is really hard to press and makes a really loud sound. And then too far from the reed, either you're going to get a dead signal or a very faint signal. So the best course of action that I found was to mark each key with an up or down arrow, signifying whether to move the plucker forward or back, and then take off the action to do those actions. This took about 8 to 10 passes before it was pretty okay, and it was definitely the most soul-crushing part, because either you're going too far forward, too far back, and you're pretty much just guessing when you're moving them. I mean, I was relatively precise, but, you know, there's no gears here. It's just a screw and wood. By the end though, it was getting pretty consistent, and a lot of those high-end notes that didn't play at all were ringing out pretty good. But we did have some oddball ringing reeds, which by taking off the action, we could find was actually just the reed in the reed bar. But tightening down the screws adjacent to the reed would usually null the ringing. Sometimes. You can also see just how close the high-end treble reeds are to the pickups. I mean, these don't even ring. Now, I always thought that the 2-screw per reed system is really weird and flawed, but I did notice you can actually tune them, at least change the tension on the reed with the screw through the action, because the damper arms are on each side of the screw, though this only works for the top half. Don't know if that's intentional, but handy. Here you can see some of the octaves. They're a little rough. So with failing to tune it by just tightening the screws, I did have to nudge the reed forward so that there was more mass on the vibrating side, thus making it a lower note. This is pretty much the main way I tuned this whole instrument, though I wouldn't say it was preferred. This was also quite frustrating just because the reeds were so temperamental and really tough to get in a good temperament. Unfortunately, I did snap the front end of one of the reeds off, so I had to move up the reed, and thankfully there was enough room to move up and then still take up that space. So then I went ahead and added solder to bring more mass to the reed, which would then lower it in pitch. There were only 3 or 4 reeds that needed to be filed, which would be removing some solder or lead from the end of the reed, just because I didn't want to risk pushing it in and breaking the tip off. But in the end, just like the voicing, it worked out pretty good. I mean, good for a 90-year-old instrument that pioneered a lot of things. Unfortunately, I just don't know what an original one would sound like. So how exactly do you know when good is? And then lastly, it was up to changing these pickup heights so that some of the bass notes were a little louder. Raising the pickups did help the overall volume of the keyboard a little bit. I mean, it was tough because those bass reeds, as they get longer and heavier, vibrate up and down farther. So you have to leave more space or they're going to hit the pickup. But here's a final little demonstration of the keyboard tuned and voiced as best as I can for now. If you watched the previous video on the other clavinet, you'll know that in the end, I actually sampled the instrument, allowing you to then play it digitally with a controller or keyboard. Well, with this one being in a much better shape, I decided to re-record all of the keys and then redo that sample program so you guys could play an even better example. You can check the link in the description for the instructions. And let's get one more demo with everything together as you would play it in a house. Also take note of how much quieter the signal is after bypassing that pedal potentiometer. We are not using the shielding, that is just in without being grounded.